Hey, good morning. Today we have Trista Bridges talking to us about SDGs and sustainability in business. She runs a sustainability focused consulting business, and she's coming out launching a brand new exciting book this week. So we're very lucky to have you. Thanks for joining, Trista.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. Would you mind just briefly introducing yourself?
Sure. Happy to introduce. I'm Trista Bridges. I'm co-founder of a consultancy called ReadTheAir, and we work with companies around transitioning to more sustainable business models. I'm originally from the U.S. I left the U.S. actually in 2000, lived in Europe for 13 years, and while I was in Europe, lived mostly in France, where I also got French nationality. So I'm technically French American because we say Franco-Américaine. So in French, we always put the French first. Anyhow.
Yeah, no, I
um,
I noticed that because you have some links to European businesses
yes,
and
exactly.
consulting. So do you speak French?
Yes, I do. So to get my nationality, I had to speak French. And it's really fascinating because we'll talk a little bit about the book later on. But one of the things we did look at is the differences of sustainability across the world and how businesses are adapting and responding. And so while I was in Europe, I actually worked mostly in consulting, in marketing consulting with a lot of very big brands, Coca-Cola, Kevlar Schweppes. So I've seen a lot around the topic of sustainability and different business practices at that time, not really at all at the center or the forefront of their thinking. But that has changed pretty substantially since then. I also worked in financial services. I ran strategy for part of Thomson Reuters, which has now been spun off into a different group. And that was interesting because I learned a lot about financial markets and how they work and the challenges around financial markets, which we also cover in the book. And then in my time, the last bit of time that I was in Europe, I actually worked as a tech blogger, which was really, it was a bit of a change for me. I wanted to do something very different, but that really, for me, was a period of time where I started asking questions about business and the world and the economy and technology, of course, which has many different challenges and issues as well. And then after my time there, I moved to Japan mostly because my husband and I wanted a bit of a change. And he actually lived here as a child. So I moved here and I just started a consultancy, and it was a bit of a leap of faith. And I still do a lot of work actually in the training and development around marketing space. That's kind of my training and background, and it's also connecting very much with sustainability at the moment as well, because many companies just they don't have strong competency in the topic around the topic of sustainability.
Yeah, for sure. We
Yeah.
will talk about that a bit later, more specifically, but I certainly have noticed that as well, how a lot of businesses, they'll wear the SDG badges. They have that kind of focus or target. We want to do more with SDGs, but not sure how. How do we put it to work? How do we put it to
Yes,
practice? So I think
exactly.
like what you're doing with your business, what you're doing with the book, has a lot of good practical advice, which I hope we can introduce today and
Sure, of
give
course.
people some inspiration how they can apply some
Absolutely.
of the ideas, right?
Yep, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so here, I should show the book too. So here's the book.
Yes.
And just to give a little background on why we wrote this book. So my co-author and co-founder, Donald Eubank, and I met maybe about 3 years ago, and we were both in very different fields, and we kind of, we bonded over this desire to see the world be in a bit more sustainable place. And I thought it would be a good idea just to write a book, which sounds a little crazy. Like I said, I've been a blogger, I've written a lot of white papers and these types of things, but I've never written a book. A book is a very different type of endeavor. So what we decided to do was just contact companies and see if they would speak to us. And at first I was skeptical because I didn't know if they would, because it's a very touchy subject for businesses. They've been under a lot of fire for it. But we reached out to all kinds of companies of all sizes, and they actually were happy to speak to us, which was fascinating. And some of them are much farther along in their sustainability journey. Some are not. And I would say, to be honest, most companies are not as far along as they need to be. That's absolutely the case if we just look at the state of the world we're in today. But it's been an incredible experience. It took about 2 years exactly to write it to the point where it's been published and it's being released, which is, as I understand, pretty average for a book in terms of timing. But it's been a wonderful experience, certainly writing the book.
And do you and Donald act more as like editors in the book, or are you writing all of the articles? Is it based on your research
Yes,
specifically?
all of our research,
Oh my goodness.
all of our writing. And the book is kind of interesting because when we were writing it, our idea was to provide a resource for people who just don't know what to do and don't understand what sustainability is, are not working in the field, because this is really the challenge, is that there's a lot of really talented, wonderful sustainability professionals, but there's not nearly enough to make substantive change in these companies. It has to become a part of just general business operating practices. And as we all know, over the last several years, last 50 years, business has gone through many different transformations since the war. At first, we saw, a very consumerist age, right, where we were, the Mad Men age, right, building up consumers, but incredible new products, but they were largely marketed by men and were largely pushing people to consume. Then we moved into the technology age, and things like marketing, concepts like marketing and marketing the way we think about it today are really very new, right? People haven't been talking about, marketing, and there's a very classic framework called the 4 Ps by Phil Kotler, who was actually the professor where I have been my business degree at Kellogg. But that really only dates to the 80s. It's not really that long a period of time where we're marketing like we know today. And I say all that to say that, businesses, in order for them to actually execute in a certain way, they need to have frameworks, they need to be trained. And with any other discipline in business, that's what we do. If it's finance, if it's marketing, it's accounting, whatever it is, people get degrees in it. They learn how to do it. Companies make it a priority. They finance people, finance training around it. They finance activities, and sustainability has got to be the same way. So the only way this happens is if we get middle managers interested in this and trained on this. And so we wrote the book from that perspective. So for a sustainability professional, I'm sure lots of sustainability professionals will be interested and may read it, which is wonderful, but they might find some parts of it, well, I already knew that. But that's because we didn't really write it for that community per se. We really wrote it for the broader community, which all of us who are in sustainability are trying to connect with, right? So it aims to do that.
Right. Do you foresee maybe students would make the most use of the book, or CSR consultants, or
Yeah.
parts of businesses that have like a CSR section they might be interested? Like
Yes.
who is going to best be able to utilize this book? What do you think?
So I think in terms of students, yes. I think that one thing that we are seeing is we're seeing a big shift amongst students around their interest in this topic. So Harvard Business Schools, apparently their number one course is a course called Reimagining Capitalism. And the fact that Harvard Business School's number one course is Reimagining Capitalism is a huge deal. I did my undergraduate at Wharton in the 90s and then went to Kellogg in the late 90s. And I can tell you that this subject never came up in any capacity, right? But now that's changing, and people, particularly millennials, followed by Generation Z, are really interested in this topic. So they're demanding more content around this. So I do hope that students will find this book useful, that professors will find out about it. Our publisher is Routledge. They're an academic publisher. They do a lot of academic publishing as well as some others as well. So they have pretty good connection to universities. So hopefully they'll be reaching out pretty aggressively to them to try to get them to kind of include the book in their course materials. After that, I would say, I think CSR professionals will find some elements of it very helpful for them. We do a whole section around measurement and how we measure sustainability, which is a huge topic and a massive problem, actually, because business people, and there may be some business people on this session today who are following, the frameworks we use are actually pretty rudimentary. They're not really super sophisticated, but they're very handy and they can be used very easily. But in sustainability, we don't yet have that. We don't yet have simple frameworks like ROI, or I said the 4 Ps before, or your project scorecards, or all these things that we use that are very, very good tools of keeping us organized and keeping us on track, right? And helping us analyze situations. We don't yet have that for sustainability, but we did provide an analysis in the book of the different frameworks that are out there and how they can be useful. So I hope that will be helpful to CSR folks. And then the last one are just general managers, people in marketing, people in strategy. I think strategy is a big area because now they're starting to incorporate this thinking. So there's a lot of information in there around what are other companies doing that's working, that's good. And some of them are even companies that you wouldn't suspect. So one of the companies we include in the book is Coca-Cola. And at first, I was a little reluctant to interview Coca-Cola because, what do you do when your project is inherently not healthy? And actually, Coca-Cola is really trying to shake that up a bit, right? So at the moment, about 70% of their profitability comes from red label Coca-Cola. So the regular Coca-Cola that we find on the shelf, not diet, not Coke Light, not Coke Zero, regular Coca-Cola. But that's changed over time. It used to be a lot higher than that. And they want to be a total beverage company. So they've done some things around pulling down the sugar levels in their drinks, which some people are very skeptical of. But the thing they've actually probably made the most progress on is plastics. And if you talk to anyone in the beverage industry, says Coca-Cola is actually doing a lot around reducing plastics, recycling plastics, reusing plastics, finding ways to move away from plastics. And they have a lot more work to do. But I think it's important to show that, companies like that are not going to go away. It's not like they're going to stop making a beverage that's inherently unhealthy overnight. But they can do a lot in moving the needle.
I think people, you can't be an idealist all the time, right? You have to live in the real world. You have to work with real businesses. And we know that when Starbucks buys fair trade coffee, it has a huge effect on the world coffee market. We know that McDonald's, when they add apple slices to their menu, has a huge change for kids' health. And, they just, like you said, Coca-Cola has a huge influence. And talking about marketing powerhouses, Coca-Cola is one of the major players. So if you can get them to, or you can find out that they're trying in some way, that changes the whole market, the beverage industry, right?
Absolutely. And we have a section at the end of the book called, it's about industry innovation. And we profile 5 industries in that book, industries like tourism, insurance, fashion and apparel, which is a huge one, health and wellness, and real estate and development construction. And our thesis is that if these 5 industries, and health and wellness, I should say, also includes food, right? Because that's the thing, as we look at health, I actually have done a lot of work in the healthcare sector, particularly for pharmaceuticals in the past. And one thing that we find is that we think of it as treating people, and we need to stop doing that. We need to think of health and wellness as a lifelong global way of managing one's lifestyle, right? We keep people out of the health system. It's better for the health system. If people eat better, it's better for the health system. So we can't look at these as isolated things anymore. We have to look at them as connected things. And so our thesis is that if these industries really made a significant step towards sustainability in a real way, it would change things for everyone. And if you look at those industries, all of them are really, really challenged industries around sustainability. So insurance, for example, if we have, as we have, I should say, these climate effects, like in Japan, for example, with the ongoing flooding we have, that hits head on insurance companies. What do? The whole insurance model is predicated on people paying a fee every month to an insurance company and the insurance company not really ever paying that out, right? What do we do when everybody has claims? And in Japan, that's actually been an issue. We ran into that a little bit in our research. In fashion and apparel, we interviewed H&M. H&M is a fast fashion business, but they recognize that it's not something they can do forever. They're really trying to find ways to innovate around that technology, looking at the fast fashion model and pulling back from that. I think they're even expanding into vintage type things as well. And they have this conscious consumers online. And do they need to do more? Absolutely. But they're doing things like trying to push fair labor practices, and they're trying to push to, better recycling and reclaiming, and not having clothes end up in landfills, which I think it's something like 60 to 70% of clothes, maybe even more, do. So it's just to say that, to your point, is absolutely right. Like it really takes an industry to change things. We can't have 1 or 2 companies doing this. They all have to be making efforts to do this. And there's more initiatives around this, but certainly a lot more to do on that front.
Yeah, for sure. There's certainly market leaders. Like if we're talking apparel, you have to mention Patagonia. They're
Yes, of
heads
course.
heads
Yeah.
and tails above the competition. We're talking beauty companies. You have to talk about Lush.
Yeah.
Like there
Yeah.
there are certain companies which, as the main mission focus, is all about sustainability, all about what can we do for people and planet. But for the major players, like H&M, like you mentioned, in fast fashion, you have to address their issues as well. And small changes can make big change, like you said.
Absolutely. And I would say just quickly, in the book, we profile 5 companies. We call them mission-driven companies. We could also call them purpose-led companies. We just kind of landed on that name. And we chose that because we wanted to say these are companies that opted to be sustainable from the start. And so we include 5 companies. And I wanted to do that because I didn't want all of the big companies to get all the shine. And I wanted to show companies that it is possible to be a successful company and to care about this and put this at the core of what you do. So in that, we profiled 2 companies, fashion and apparel. KEEL Footwear, which you probably know, a really interesting company because they do 2 things that I find really interesting. One, they do innovation, right? And they don't innovate until they don't release an innovation until they test as to whether it's sustainable or not. So they actually will wait and sometimes get beat by their competitors in some ways until something is verified as sustainable. Another thing they do is they actually own some of their production facilities. So most fashion and apparel companies do not own what they don't own in factories produce their own clothing. Most use contract manufacturing, upwards of 99%. A lot of them. They have a mix where they use a bit of contract manufacturing, but they also have their own production facilities. And that changes completely how they think about this and what they can control, what they can test. And then the last thing is they're politically active. And they're a U.S. company, which we rarely see. In the workplace, we see lobbyists, right? We don't see within the companies encouraging their employees to be politically active. That's starting to change, especially with the recent movement in the U.S., the Black Lives Matter movement and such. But I think they've been a pioneer in terms of those issues. And then we interview also a Japanese company as well, a smaller company I can talk about a little bit later, and a couple others as well. So it's just to say that it is possible to build companies with sustainable business models that are successful. We just need more of them, and we need big companies moving towards those models.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned some interesting examples that we'll draw on later, but you also sent me a chart about
Yes,
SDGs,
yes,
survey of SDGs in annual and sustainability reports,
yes.
102 companies total. Can you introduce that?
Sure. So in that report, what we did is we just took a look at 102 large companies and their annual reports, and we looked to see, are they doing things like talking about sustainability? Are they talking about the SDGs? Are they integrating that into their strategy, and are they executing on it? And what we found, and this was actually a very consistent finding with another larger study that was actually done. I forget who did it, but very similar findings that companies are, if you look at their annual reports, they're talking a lot about this, a lot. And not just in the sustainability report, but in their annual reports now. And for me, the sustainability report movement, which you may or may not know, in some regions of the world was basically legally mandated. In Europe, this was the case, where many countries said you have to produce a sustainability report, which I think is important and great. But when they start talking about in their annual report, it's a totally different ball game, if you will, because that means that it's central to what they do, right? It's not just a marketing tool, and then investors are also interested in it. So we found that they're talking about it a lot, but when they talk about what they're planning to do, so what are their priorities for the next 5 years or however long, there were very few of them who actually were doing it. And so you'll see the 28% number. I don't have it in front of me, but that shows you, it's very consistent that there's very few who are actually incorporating it in their core strategies and activities as a company. And what does that mean? That means things like if you're a consumer products company, you make, I don't know, soap, that you've actually looked at, where you're sourcing materials from, where are you producing it, what harmful effects does it have? Does it at least do no harm? Right? And you would want to be talking about that. Are you messaging about that to consumers? Have you looked at certifications? And again, none of these things are perfect, but they are absolutely signals that the company is taking this seriously. So that's just to say that this is just the beginning of the game. And, oftentimes you hear people say, well, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of more consultants around sustainability, like myself, and books. But actually, the amount of books and people working on this are negligible versus the amount of people who work on, for example, change management. We have multi-billion-dollar firms that's all they do is go into companies and help them it used to be install software systems, but now it's basically go into the cloud or become digitalized or this type of thing. We have millions of people who work on that issue. We don't have millions of people working on sustainability. And this is to say that 28% number shows you how much opportunity there is in this space. And people who are in the country who have ambition, and companies, for example, who have ambition to change, hopefully this will be a career path in the future. People who, like myself, who want to work in an advisory capacity, content, books, research, we need more and more and more of it to help move that 28% number at least north of 50%.
Yeah, it's so important to have so many people from a variety of areas of the world, and different focuses, key focus areas. But I find that data really interesting. So the fact that they might have a consultant in every now and again and talk about it, that's not going to be activated, actually making differences in your company. What do you find with the successful companies? How often do they reassess? How often do they make targets? How often do they assign people to work on hitting the targets? Like with successful companies, you must see a big difference in their active strategy to make it happen.
Absolutely. So the big movement of the last 20 years has been reporting on water consumption, reporting on carbon, reporting all these types of things, right? So you'll find a lot of companies that say, we're doing great things. Look, we're reducing our water impacts. We're reducing our carbon footprint, that type of thing. But that's just not enough. Like that's just, doing, I would say we have this concept in business, which is called table stakes. And table stakes means the basic level of things you do just to compete in your industry, right? And that's what those things have become. They're important, and there's, again, more progress needed on those things. But that's not really so much about what they're doing around their strategic choices. So most companies have business planning processes, and good companies around sustainability actually incorporate sustainability in their business planning processes. So we talked to one company, very large Japanese conglomerate, I won't say who it is, and we asked them, there was a gentleman who was responsible for sustainability, and we asked him, okay, when you're doing a project, how do you decide whether to do it or not, right? Every company, when they go, especially large projects, they always go through this ROI exercise, right? Where they determine whether it's in their interest to do that project. And I asked them, where does sustainability sit within that process? And actually, it sits for them at the end of the process. So they've already decided they're going to do this thing. And then they go to him and say, is this a problem?
Oh, dear.
And that's not the way you do it, right?
It's not very sustainable, that,
No.
like it
because
needs
he can't
to
say
be
no.
part of the beginning, part of the planning process needs to
Exactly.
have it in. Oh, wow, that's crazy.
So, but you imagine the position he's in, right? He's probably not in a position that has much political capital in the company either. He's kind of there as the check, right? So he's getting all this pressure from people, probably his boss and others, just to say yes. And to say, okay, here's a few things we can do to limit the impact. But the companies are really good at this. They see sustainability as an opportunity. And it is how they make choices as a company, right? They go on the market and they say, okay, what are consumers saying about this? And say consumers aren't really totally well developed on this topic. Then they say, you know what? I'm going to take the mantle and I'm going to teach consumers about this. And I'm going to make this as important, because this is what companies do. All the time, they propose products and services to us that we do not need, right? And they convince us that we need it. Sustainability is the same, right? And one company we talked to is an Italian company called Bolton Foods. And they're the number one canned fish manufacturer in Europe. And so they decided that they were going to go to a sustainable tuna product for all of their products within Europe. And they went after this certification that's called the Marine Stewardship Council, MSC. And the gentleman who leads that is actually their sustainability director, and he is also on the council as well. And they actually saw it as their job, because in Europe, people are aware of overfishing. They're very aware of sustainability, but they're not really so much aware of, well, what does that really mean? And how do I tell if it's sustainable or not? And does the certification matter? And they actually said it is our job as a company to also educate consumers about this and to lead them on the journey that we are also trying to go on.
Yeah.
And they really work to make sure. They work in Indonesia, for example, helping to convert fisheries towards sustainability. And to me, that is really the example of a company that is trying to kind of work at this at multiple angles, right?
Yeah.
Not just say, here's what we're doing that's nice in our annual report, or here's a company that we're giving some money to. They're actually incorporating in what they do, and they see it as a responsibility to enact change in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, you see the need for educating the consumer right now as Japan is rolling out the no plastic bags for free policy.
Yes.
How many stores do I go to now and they're trying to use the thin plastic, wrapping bag and give that to the customer as part of customer
Exactly, yeah.
service instead of educating the customer and being like, oh, that's great. You have your own bag. Fantastic. Thank you. Nothing
Yes.
positive about good behavior. It's like they are assuming that all the customers are really upset about this. So I'm going to put it in another plastic bag kind of
Yes.
as a loophole of getting out of this because I assume that the customer hates it. Whereas this
Absolutely.
is not going to help the transition. So when you find a way to educate the customer and then the customer feels your product, your service has greater value, that's better branding for you, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
oh my
Absolutely.
gosh, it's so complicated. I love this chart that you sent to me on the 5 steps. Maybe this is a good time to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So the 5 steps, just quite simply. So the first level is really just kind of general awareness and understanding in the organization. And a lot of companies have cleared that hurdle, right? I mean, it's almost like it's not really so linear in the sense that everybody goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's kind of back and forth some ways, but we kind of use it as a general framework in terms of how we think about companies in this journey. The next step is really this kind of senior level awareness. Because what's actually interesting and happening in Japanese companies is that the senior levels of the company, so the CEOs, the COOs, these very senior people, they actually kind of like it, right? They really were the ones who said, SDGs, we have to push these forward. But Japanese companies are a bit unique in that the senior leader of the company has a lot of power, but isn't necessarily the only decision maker. A lot that happens at the middle management layer, kind of just goes on as business as usual. And it takes a real kind of strong mandate or action to kick everybody into action, right? So you have a lot of Japanese companies that are at this point too, which is where, senior leaders are really trying to get behind this, but, the other levels are struggling with that. And I would also say that's probably also because many of these very senior levels of Japanese companies, you have a lot of people who've been around a very long time, right? So they really were part of kind of the resurgence after the war as young people, and helping to kind of rebuild Japan, since the 60s and 70s and certainly in the 80s when things got, they were at their height. But people behind that weren't really told that they needed to do much around this topic, right? So they're a little skeptical, right? They're quite skeptical. So it kind of gets blocked. And also I would say that Japanese companies also, they've been around so long, a lot of them actually were very sustainable in their foundings in their past. It's just that after the war, again, this kind of consumerist model was really pushed as a way to rebuild. So I think that there's a mindset that's different, which is interesting between these two generations of people. And then the third step is the first wins, as we call it. So they basically go and people try some things and they have maybe a product that's sustainable. Or like, for example, H&M would probably be a good example of this at the moment. They have, these conscious consumerist lines that are doing better. They're really working with their contract manufacturers to help them have better labor practices. They're doing some really interesting things there, but I wouldn't say, I mean, their business model is still kind of, it is as it is. And they're certainly ahead of some others in the sector. For example, if you take Gap, I'd say they're definitely ahead of Gap. But you know, they're still doing these first wins. And then the next step 4, is where you really start to see more of this integration across the company, right? And you start seeing, so for example, one company profile in the book is called Givaudan. Givaudan is the world's leading flavor and fragrance company. So if you drink a tea that tastes like jasmine, or if you, you know, you go and you get that, you know, stuff you put in, you know, we call it bouillon in French, but bouillon cubes that you put in flavor soup. The flavor was developed probably by Givaudan or a couple other companies. They are massively huge. And so this is a company that has a massive environmental impact, right? Because they use everything that comes from nature to make flavors and scents, perfuming as well, right? This comes from flowers and plants and these types of things. But they've really been pushing on sustainability in recent years, and they've just announced that they're going to become what's called a certified B Corporation. And B Corporation is becoming kind of the global standard for certifying what sustainable companies are. And so Danone, which people probably know on the call, the yogurt and dairy company, French company, have pushed to become B Corporations. They're a certified B Corporation in US, and they just announced that they're one in Japan as well. So they just received this certification for Japan, the first of its kind, actually. I think there was one other certified B Corp in Japan. So it's a huge deal in the consumer product sector. And so now Givaudan is also going to that. And so what that's going to require them to do is to start integrating it into everything. Because in order to get the certification, it's pretty rigorous, actually, and quite difficult to do. So I'd say that's an example of a company that's really kind of moving pretty aggressive in stage 4. And then stage 5 are these kind of companies that really are, like you talked about, Patagonia. Unilever is probably more around 4, but Unilever has absolutely been at the forefront. Paul Pullman, their previous CEO, has really pushed them towards a sustainable direction. And now the current CEO is still moving that forward. So they're considered one of the leaders in that sector as well. But, you know, 5 is kind of the nirvana of business sustainability. And, you know, it's hard to get to. And I do hope that one day we'll have, you know, whole sectors or huge proportions of industries at least that are there. Because I think in order to deal with a lot of the problems that we have, we're going to have a lot of companies to get to that stage. Yeah. And they won't be perfect, right? But it's a total shift in how they would operate.
And the fact that you have third-party assessment outside the company, not internal assessment, which is going to be biased in some way, but third-party assessment is so important. So I'm really inspired to hear about B Corp. Is that becoming kind of well known in Japan as well, would you say?
It's not yet, but I do know that the Japanese, you know, in Japan, you know, when these concepts come in, they actually have task forces and study groups at the governmental level to look at these things. And apparently there's a task force that's looking at this to see how it can be useful. I don't think it's very well known yet. It's definitely not known amongst consumers, but it is absolutely a great tool. And one other thing I would say about it is you can actually screen your company on the criteria they use to give the certification for free. So if you don't feel that you're ready to get the certification, you can use the tools on their website to see where you are as a company. And I think that in itself is valuable, right?
That's
There's
huge.
so many public tools available for companies to use. And if it's unruly, it doesn't really matter. The point is for you just to see where you're at.
I mean, that is great. The criticism of a lot of third-party certification systems, like even fair trade, organic. They cost a lot of money. So a lot of small and medium-sized businesses are not going to have the funds to get certified. So they might be very high-level sustainable company or totally organic, but they can't go through the process because it takes too long, it's too expensive, right? So that's a big part of the difficulty, I think, in getting certified for a lot of these companies, especially smaller.
Exactly. And the companies I talked about, the mission-driven companies, none of them, I believe, are B Corps, maybe one. But these are companies that have been sustainable from the beginning. Their whole product offering was structured around sustainability, right? So it is, and I'm not saying that everybody has to get a certification, but I am saying there are tools available so companies can at least see how they're doing.
Yeah.
And that alone is really valuable because it makes you think, it makes you reflect, it makes you say, maybe I should look at some of these companies to see what they're doing, right? Some of these B Corps, and see if I can replicate a little bit of that. So it's incredibly helpful, I'd say, in that way.
Let me add some comments. We've had some nice comments so far. Sabrina has said that is so encouraging. Sabrina is also going to be one of the guest speakers this week. Thank you, Sabrina. Melanie Brock says, another amazing and important discussion. You're both rock stars. Super grateful for this series and the terrific speakers like Trista. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Melanie.
Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, awesome. You have some really interesting examples, but before we dive into specific examples again, let's talk a little bit about today's event that you're doing. Can you introduce that?
So Donald, let's mention Donald Eubank, and I and a couple others that we're working with on a project on impact investing are hosting a session tonight with Temple University. It's a Zoom session. Everybody is invited to join. And basically, it's about impact investing. So what is impact investing? Impact investing means that instead of investing and thinking just about financial profit, we also think about return around social issues, around the environment. So we put at the same plane people, profit, planet, right? So an impact investment does not mean that it loses money. This is really important to point out. It means that there's value, absolutely, not just for our society and for our environment in investing in better companies, but there also can be very, very profitable. And what we're seeing is we're seeing more and more companies and more startups like this. And we want to, in Japan, there's been a lot of effort around this topic in recent years, but not nearly enough. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to forward that conversation. We're working on a project, which is an impact exchange project, where companies can kind of find different projects and invest in them. And we can provide a knowledge hub. And there's a very good organization here called SIF that's done incredible work for years around this topic. And I know would be delighted if there be more momentum even around this topic within Japan. But I think in the future, and I did a talk on impact investing a couple months back, something like if you look at the private equity space, so people, private equity funds or venture capital funds, something like, I think it's like 95% of the money that goes into that sector or that's invested in that sector are in just traditional non-impact oriented investments. The amount of impact investing money that goes, money that goes to impact investments or companies that have this kind of purpose-led, mission-driven positioning or product mix, it's just minuscule. It is absolutely minuscule. If we could even move that to 20% or 30% or 40%, it would change things fundamentally. So this session is meant to talk about what is impact investing, what is the state of impact investing in Japan, and how can we advance that? And we have, again, SIF that's speaking with Heather McLeish from E&Y, who's incredible in this space and has been a really incredible thought leader around sustainability and such in Japan. We also have two speakers from SIF, another speaker actually from Shinsei Bank. Shinsei Bank has an impact investing fund that they launched a couple years ago, which is really very exciting. And they're going to talk as well. So it's going to be a great discussion. And we also these sessions are in English, but we always want Japanese voices during the session. So we always make sure to have some speakers that are Japanese. We have a lot of participants that are Japanese. And there's a lot of people in Japan who want to change the narrative and want to change kind of how things work here a bit. So, they're going to be the ones who lead that, this is their country. They're the ones who have the influence in to affect a lot of change within companies and within different organizations in Japan. So I encourage everyone, if you can come, please do. You can join. We're starting at 7 o'clock. First hour, we have the talks, and then for about an hour after, we just have open discussion. And people can stay on, they can drop off, and it's usually a pretty fun time. And I'll say this is the 7th, I think, in the series that we've done with Temple. We've also done talks over the last year around just general sustainability. We did circular economy, we did ESG, climate, sustainable innovation, and COVID-19, and what it's going to actually do to sustainability, because that's a huge topic
Yeah.
in itself.
After the pandemic, how do you move business forward? It's the same for travel, right? What is the future of travel
Yeah.
after a pandemic? There's a lot of issues worth discussing. How often do you do these events? Are they monthly?
We were doing them monthly. Now they've decided to expand it a little bit. And we also have lots of other things going on. So we do it about once every other month.
Okay. And
And
you can,
so
for the one tonight, you can sign up through Eventbrite and it is
for
free.
PTix, I think it's on PTix. I think
Uh,
I shared the link. You might
it's
find it on Eventbrite too.
Yeah, I've got
Both.
the one you sent me is Eventbrite, but
Okay.
you
Okay,
can
good.
check Piatix as well. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So please do join if you can. It promises to be a really interesting and fun discussion.
that's awesome. And let's talk a little bit before we talk about your business examples from the book, which are
Mhm.
definitely worth talking about. Let's talk about what your business does. I've got here a picture: long range, tailor made engagements, facilitated workshops.
Yes.
So I've got these 4 services that you offer. Can you
Yeah.
introduce that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we work with companies around various different aspects of sustainability. I would say at the moment that the demand that we really have in Japan is actually more for information and training. So we do a lot of work, and so Temple is one example of that, right? That type of work. We do case studies for learning. We do work with directly with the people in, particularly in HR, because what's happening is a lot of, again, managers are asked to be doing something with this. So they need tools, they need case studies, they need frameworks to do that. So we've been doing work around that because in Japan, that's really where the need and demand is at this point. Another area that's really of need are things like research reports. In Japan, in particular, we would think that there's lots of information available, but actually, it's almost like sometimes there's this wall between Japan and the rest of the world on some things. So there's very good knowledge, I think, about what's happening on within Japan, but not so much outside of Japan. So we're often asked to provide these insights, this type of research, this type of information about what's going on globally, what's happening with other, for example, in the impact investing space. We've had some requests around this. What's happening with other impact funds? Is it growing in other markets? What are the types of investments that are being done? What measurement techniques are in place? This is another huge area. So we can advise companies on strategy, right? But at the moment, we're working a lot around training, development, and information gathering and knowledge building, because that's where Japan is kind of as a market at this point in time.
Yeah, great. It's so worthwhile and so needed right now. I think in
Yeah,
Japan, well, needed anywhere, but these are discussions that should be happening all over Japan in every business, small, medium, large, all of them.
exactly.
You should
And I will
at least discuss it. So
exactly.
if you don't know how, definitely reach out to Trista and Donald at ReadTheAir.
Yes,
And
read the Trista, readtheair.jp.
I'm showing your website right now. I'm showing your Instagram page that you just started. So you guys are pretty easy to reach
Great
out
to
to.
find, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
will say in Japan that there, within the period that we wrote this book, Japan has really improved on this topic of sustainability. I think pretty fundamentally, I would say, to their credit. And people love the SDGs here in the corporate world, which is very different than the U.S. actually.
Is
In the
that right?
U.S.,
Hmm.
so talk just a second about different regions. So the U.S. is a very by nature, wherever you sit on the political divide, people tend to be very skeptical of institutions, and that includes the UN. And as we know, this is the SDGs were something that was an initiative that was developed by the UN. Although I will say that businesses around the world like them a lot, and one reason they like them is that there's 17 of them, and you almost have to be blind not to find your business within them. So there's something for everyone in the SDGs, and I think it may seem a little simplistic or silly, but it actually is really important, right? It's important for businesses to feel like that's my area, and I need to probably work on some things in that area. That's what I think we should focus on, right?
Yeah.
And in Japan, that's happened. most large Japanese companies are really scrambling in some ways to embrace the SDGs, to understand how their activities align around the SDGs. Now, the next step is actually to make more concrete actions, and some are farther along than others. But I will say that the SDGs have been incredibly helpful in Japan in getting people focused around the SDG sustainability. And I'd say even in the consumer world, you go into the metro, you see the SDGs, and particularly with the Olympics, which were supposed to happen and may have, this probably has also helped too, actually, because it brought a little bit more spotlight onto Japan. But yeah, I think we're seeing change in Japan, and it's just to say that there's a lot more change that's needed to catch up to some other parts of the world. And Europe is probably the most advanced on this. And a lot of that is just because the public in Europe cares a lot about this, right? The European people fundamentally believe that the environmental situation is a catastrophe, and we need to do something about it. It is the home of Fridays for the Future, of Extinction Rebellion, and I think that there's some really great examples coming out of Europe. And again, you have the emerging markets, right? You have South America, you have continent. The thing that's interesting about in Africa and India, that's interesting about these places is that they actually have an opportunity, because they're developing so fast, to perhaps do things differently than we did. Because if they do things like we did, then we're really in trouble.
Yeah.
And there's some numbers that say that, actually, if every developed country does the right thing, so we all do the right thing, we're all in the Paris Accords, the U.S. comes back to the Paris Accords, we all, we all respect that and do what we're supposed to do, take our actions, it still only solves 40% of the problem. So we have to engage with emerging markets. They are the future, absolutely. And we need to work collaboratively with them, not in a heavy-handed way, but to help. Maybe they can inspire some change in us too, right?
Yeah.
Because they have a lot of wonderful examples.
Definitely. And don't just disregard it as it's going to be too expensive. I think it's too expensive not to do it. In terms of your brand loyalty, we know that 80% of all people looking for travel options are looking for sustainable travel options. And I am sure the percentage is as high for any consumer. If you have a choice between a sustainable product or service and one that's not, you're going to pay a little bit more and have that higher value, because that's the kind of person you want to be, right?
Yes. Absolutely. And that's changing. And we're starting to see some research that consumers, there was a very good study out of NYU, Stern Centers for Sustainability. And it basically said that something like 51% of products, new value in consumer products over the last 11 years has come from sustainable products, sustainable position products. Okay. I'm not saying for sure they were sustainable, but that means that the consumer cared about it. And they're also seeing research that people are willing to pay a bit more for it. And you talked about examples of companies. There's a really good example of a company here in Japan called, you probably know Seksui House, who is the home builder here. And they took a decision in 2009, 2010, right around after the financial crisis, before the great earthquake, to move to these zero energy homes and to move to these energy efficient and more sustainable homes. And in Japan, that actually was interpreted by the consumer as a better built home. So they've actually been able to get people to buy a premium product here, that maybe people would have thought, well, consumers never going to spend that. The home is an expensive thing. They're probably going to try to find ways to cut corners, but actually no. And they were one of the first builders here to really embrace this concept. And now they get a lot of recognition globally, and they were a lovely company actually to talk with. Very, very interesting what they're doing. But to just say it is possible, and it happens in Japan, and they were a wonderful example of the book that we highlighted.
Yeah.
Around.
I had a great discussion with Kevin Meyerson in one of the early episodes of the series, and he decided to invest in a passive house. So his house is one of the most sustainable you will ever find in the world. It costs a lot more, but it's so well insulated. It has solar panels. It's so efficient that he has already figured he's paid off compared to a new build of a standard house that wasn't efficient as his. you end up, it's an investment. You save money over the long term.
You
But
do, yeah.
but this is the choice that a lot of businesses are making for the short term cost
Yeah,
benefit analysis. You have to at least look 5 years down the line and how
absolutely.
the world needs positive changes that have less impact on the environment and
Absolutely.
better for your community.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sabrina just commented it costs about 20% more. Yeah, the passive house, or Hawaii had an initiative from the government saying that all new builds have to have solar panels. People will
Interesting.
complain, but
Yeah,
in the long run, they'll be thankful to have lower energy bills or self-sufficient energy. I mean,
exactly.
it's all a choice for the long term or short term, right?
And, yeah, and going off the grid, there's a big movement to go off the grid, particularly in the United States. Among some people who you would think don't care. Like, there's some very, 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 conservative folks too who are now
Yeah.
saying there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Well,
Yeah,
self-reliance is very
self-reliance.
attractive.
Exactly, exactly. So I think this is something everybody can get around, right?
Yeah.
There's something positive for everyone in this, and I think we need to realize that if we're going to change, everybody has to change something.
Yeah.
For the most
You
part,
you had
most
a
everybody.
you had another interesting example of Eco Concrete.
Yes, exactly. So that's actually an Israeli American startup, and founded by a woman, or actually a man and a woman, but the main person speaking about this company is a woman, Shimrit. An incredible company, because what they're doing is they have a concrete substance. It's not actually concrete, but what it does is it doesn't destroy biodiversity. And one of the biggest challenges we've had in recent years is building up of shorelines, particularly as countries develop. We've seen this throughout Asia. They just build these concrete structures around shorelines. They use concrete structures to reinforce shorelines. And so what she wanted to do was move away from that and use a substance that would encourage biodiversity. And so this has been an incredible hit. And it's actually, she's worked, of course, in Israel, but I think also in New York City. She's done some work with New York City. They just raised several $1 million in additional investment. But this is one of the ones we actually highlight in the book as one of these mission-driven companies, because I wanted to show that even in an industry that's very old-fashioned, that's very traditional, right? Concrete, you don't get much more, traditional, I think, than concrete. We can innovate. We can do things that help the world as opposed to deplete the world or cause negative impacts on the world. So she
Yeah.
is an absolute
Great.
inspiration
Great
around
example.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to rush through. We only have 8 more minutes. You want to talk about LIMEX?
Oh, LIMEX, yes. So that's a Japanese company. It's called TimeBridge. Actually, it's a company called TimeBridge Management, which is a bit of an innovation studio. And they were looking for ways to innovate around sustainable products. And they were looking at existing things from elsewhere. So they found this technology that's actually a Taiwanese technology, and it's very old. It dates back several hundred years, and it's using limestone, which is, as I understand, is more of a regenerative substance, and to produce paper. So using it for like my book cover, or especially in Japan, there are so many brochures used. Every time you walk into an office, every time you go to an event, they just throw paper at you, right? And so they said, could we use use limestone to produce that type of high quality paper? And so they did. And actually, it's been an incredible success. And a lot of companies in Japan are using this now. And they're working with some other countries, I think maybe Indonesia, definitely Saudi Arabia, I think, to develop production facilities in those countries. It's also moving into plastic replacements. So things like you see, I mean, we're not on airplanes at the moment, unfortunately, because of, other thing that's going on, but airplanes produce a whole lot of plastic waste. And so they're looking at ways to be able to replace that. Now, what are the challenges of this technology? Firstly, what do you do to recycle it? We have a whole system around recycling plastic, right? For
Which
better
is
or worse.
not effective.
Yeah, for better or worse, this has been in place for a long time. So they have to work with authorities in certain areas. They're working with some local municipalities to experiment around how do we collect and recycle this, because you can bring it back to them, and then they can actually recycle it. But there has to be a supply chain. I don't know if that's the right word.
Infrastructure. There needs to be waste management infrastructure that takes it in. Yeah.
Exactly. So all these new plastic replacements are wonderful, but if there's no system to handle them or deal with them, then they're almost useless.
Yeah. On the very basic level, if they are biodegradable in some way, then that's a win already, right?
Yeah.
Because when we do our monthly cleanups, we find all kinds of plastic wrappers, containers, everything.
Yeah.
So it ends up in the waterways. So if you can find a way to make it biodegradable, even though a lot of trash is burnt in Japan, that's a win. Because if it ends up in the waters, it won't be such a huge problem. Let's talk about renewable.
Yeah, renewable. So that's basically using food waste as a fertilizer, right? And using it as a fertilizer in a way to replace the chemical fertilizers that we use now. And the woman who developed it was really interesting because she used to be, I think she worked as a teacher in Harlem. It's kind of a substitute teacher or a temporary teacher or in one of these types of programs. And she saw how young people were not eating in the right way. They were not eating in a nutritious way. They weren't getting access to nutritious meals. And so she was shocked, however, on the other side, if you just go downtown, I guess, how much food is wasted, how much good food is wasted. So she came up with this idea to use that as a way to produce fertilizer and to do it in a biodegradable way and to have it to be this fertilizer that's not really fertilizer, but that can be used around organic production in food as well. So they've been working with a whole host of organic farms across the U.S. They've been trying to build up and scale out there. And I will say about the U.S. is a really interesting place around sustainability because it is really two camps. It is the people who are doing amazing, incredible things. There's such great innovation coming out of the U.S. around sustainability. And then a lot of people who just don't care, who are just so connected to the lifestyle, right, which is consumption oriented. So some of the companies we talk about in the book are American companies, and they're doing incredible things. It's just that there's not yet. I think that's changing, particularly around climate, and pretty quickly with all that's going on at the moment. I think it's going to change around healthcare, but just general consensus, like you see in other regions where 80% of people are like, yep, that's a problem. In the US, it's still a bit split, but there is a lot of really interesting innovation, and this is one company as well. Also another female founder as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. Fantastic initiative. Let's talk about KEEL. You mentioned them quickly.
Yes, I did. And they're actually expanding throughout Asia. And they say that one of their challenges is that, when you have a brand that has a sustainability positioning, the market and the people in the market may not necessarily align with that. So they found that Japan is actually their most welcoming market around that positioning in Asia, which is really, I thought, was quite interesting. And so they're doing pretty well here. But they've had to, for example, they had some examples in some other parts of Asia where people would put a girl in a bikini next to their shoe. And they're like, that's not, if you're in nature, it's about the nature. It's not about the girl in the bikini, sitting near the sea. So they've had to deal with that, right? How do we ensure that all of our operations around the world are on message with this, right? And are doing things as they should be, which is very challenging, I'd say, if you're a company that's looking to expand internationally, but absolutely necessary to do so. And KEEL is kind of a funny company because when they started in late 90s or early 2000s, they were focusing around sustainability, but not maybe as much as they are now. And then the tsunami happened of 2004. And they were going to do this huge ad campaign, and they decided to divert their whole ad campaign money towards relief for the tsunami. And that was really the time that changed them fundamentally as a company. They even talk about that to this day, about how that defined them as a company and their values. So they are absolutely I don't like to use warrior, but for things like conservationism, for example, equality, innovating and not having negative impacts on the environment. Very, very interesting company. And the last thing I will say is they built their shoes to last. So if parts of your shoe fall off or fall apart or damage, you can actually contact them. They will send you replacement parts. So another important part of sustainability is building products that last, right? Mm-hmm. And not products that have short lifespans.
Or take responsibility for what happens when the product is at end of use, right? Exactly. Like taking it back, reusing parts, giving spare parts, allowing fixing infrastructure like Patagonia does in their stores. I
Yes.
mean, this is a responsible company for sure.
Exactly.
We are at the 1 hour mark. I don't want to stop. You have other fantastic examples in your book.
Yeah.
Everybody go out and get that book. It's
Yeah, I'll quote it again.
full of great
Yes.
insights and ideas to get you and your business started, but also to inspire you if you're seeking a more sustainable lifestyle, I would say.
Exactly.
I'm looking forward to getting my own copy. I want to just mention before we finish about you being on the board of the Tokyo American Club now.
Yes, yes.
Congratulations.
I was elected to the board almost 2 years ago. I'm probably going to be running again this year. We'll see. And it's been a very interesting experience. I mean, I think you know about travel space, and that's connected actually to the experiential space, right? All of these spaces we have where we have events, like TAC is that example. Lots of events require people to be together. And so COVID has been a massive challenge for TAC. It has been a challenge for many different types of structures and entities around the world. So I think as a board member, I never anticipated, right, these issues kind of coming together. But they absolutely are. And it's been a really interesting experience, I think. And TAC is kind of an institution, but an institution also that continues to change and have different challenges and opportunities over time.
Yeah, wonderful. And I want to mention that you are a wife, you are a mother, and
Yes.
you are doing so much wonderful work. Thank you so much for everything you do. And I hope you're finding some way to balance your work-life situation right now. I know that's a challenge for everybody, especially working from home.
Oh, yes. And my husband is a venture capitalist. So, and our son is 9 years old. He's very patient because we're always working. And I feel, but we are at least here with him and we can give him time. And that's a great thing. And, the book is called Leading Sustainably. And sustainably, we talk about sustainability, but also in terms of life and work-life balance and all these things. And I think it applies to me in many ways, personally as well as professionally.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all your insights and your passion for sustainability with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Join us again tomorrow. We're talking to Chuck Kaiser at 9 a.m. So please join us then. Have a good day, everyone. Take care. Bye.